Welcome to our final panel of the day. My name is Baehr, and I'm one of the students involved with the Yale Forum on Faith and Politics. And we have reached our final panel for the day, which is called Getting Down to Business, Shaping a New Moral Agenda. We began this morning with an act of worship and prayer, establishing in a formal way that this conference is not simply an academic exercise, but that for many of us it is a spiritual endeavor. Many involved in articulating moral questions in the public square do so at least partly based on their faith in God. Advancing moral agendas need not be Machiavellian, and I hope, as we've seen today, that politics and public policy can be done out of a sincere faith. This afternoon we laid out the theological foundations for political engagement, asking where in our sacred texts and traditions do we find the mandate for political engagement. We then surveyed the landscape of America's church-state separation issues, asking what does it look like for a religious people to live in a secular nation. And now we're going to turn to a normative and strategic discussion of how we might actually shape this new moral agenda, what it looks like, what's on it, and how we execute it. There's sort of three stages chronologically we're going to go through in this time we have together. First, we're going to look at some of these recent developments of unlikely coalitions that have advocated a particular moral agenda in an area of public policy. We'll ask what these coalitions were about, how they were formed, and what we might be able to learn from them. Then we'll look for areas of growth, surveying existing coalitions and identifying some areas that might be ripe for cooperation. And finally, because we shouldn't be naive about the fault lines of separation of church and state, we'll identify some of these red flags, potentially contentious issues, and ask what can we learn from them, how might we avoid them, or at least not have them be parasitic on our efforts. Because we have so much to cover, I'll ask our amazing cast of speakers to keep your remarks brief and to the point, and hopefully we'll have a lively exchange. So to that end, let me introduce really briefly our huge cast of characters and amazing scholars, politicians, commentators, academics, theologians, etc. I've divided our group into roughly three categories. The first is our media category with Bob Abernethy, host of Religion and Ethics News Weekly. We move to David Heim, executive editor of the Christian Century, Marvin Olasky, the editor of World Magazine, and Tom Roberts, editor-at-large of the National Catholic Reporter. The next group I'm calling the activists. We start with Richard Land of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Lisa Sharon Harper of New York Faith and Justice, Jim Wallis of Sojourners, Jen Butler of Faith and Public Life, and Tyler Stevenson of Faithful Security. And finally, our last category I'm calling commentators. And I know these aren't really accurate terms, but I'm trying my best. First, we'll start out with Melissa Mathis, who's the coordinator of the Women, Religion, and Globalization Project. Next, we move to Michael Lindsay, professor of sociology and also author of Faith in the Halls of Power. Randy Balmer, professor visiting at Yale and from Barnard College, author of Thy Kingdom Come. And finally, David Kinnaman, president of Barna Research and author of Unchristian. So this is our amazing cast of people which could offer for you days and days of interesting dialogue, but unfortunately we only have about 90 minutes. So to that end, let's first look at coalitions past and present. Let's get right into this discussion. We've seen in a book by Alan Hertzky this idea that since the mid-1990s, we've seen some intriguing new coalitions among strange bedfellows. These groups include liberal Jews, conservative evangelicals, Catholics, and secular human rights activists. Richard, I'd like to direct this to you. You've been in the middle of a lot of these unlikely coalitions around international religious freedom, the sex trafficking issue, even human rights in North Korea. Can you tell us a little bit about how some of these coalitions were birthed? What was their origin?
Well, as people began to talk about these issues, and as they met and were in meetings, they began to realize that they had some common agendas around such things as human rights, freedom of conscience, suffering around the world. I mean, after all, evangelicals we knew about William Wilberforce before the rest of the country rediscovered him. And so we decided, we're going to make common cause on these issues that we care about. Another one that you didn't mention was the war in Sudan, which a lot of people across the political spectrum and the religious spectrum were working to try to bring a peace treaty and a peace settlement there in a war that has caused the death of over 2 million Sudanese. And of course, the sex trafficking issue. I mean, it's Condoleezza Rice spoke at the Southern Baptist Convention in 2006, and she got 14 standing ovations, by the way. And one of them was when she said slavery didn't end in the 19th century; it's still around today, and we are committed to not resting until it ceases. So I think it came out of a sense of there's a broader agenda here where there is agreement and where we can work together, and we should work together, and it's our obligation to work together and try to make a difference.
Jen, I love your organization's mission. It says, faith in public life envisions a country in which diverse religious voices for justice and the common good consistently impact public policy. Could you tell us a little bit about the diversity of the types of people that you're reaching out to? What do these coalitions look like? If I can prevail upon you to share your mics.
Yeah, I mean, we're excited about what we're seeing because we're a new organization, and we started this wondering just how far could we go in terms of coalition building. And we're finding that we're able to work, just across the faith and political spectrum, whether it's the issue of immigration, where we had Richard Land and Sam Rodriguez to a press conference that was really helpful in forming that debate at a significant turning point, or, whether it's people in Ohio who are teaming up, moderates and progressives together to restore civility to the debate in Ohio because they felt like it had been too polarized in 2004. And what we got so excited about there as we supported this coalition, which was called We Believe Ohio, was that they really had a proactive solution to diversifying the values debate in their state. They really wanted to unite around common ground, bread and butter issues that affect families daily. And so we're just seeing a lot of people right now really struggling at the local level and at the national and international level to overcome some of the ideological divides that have separated us.
And are these are mostly Christians involved in churches, or are they people of different faiths? Or
this is across the spectrum. I mean, I think sometimes, funny enough, we can be the most divided within our own particular faith. But in Cleveland, Ohio, for example, I was really touched when we led a retreat for 40 key faith leaders in that city. They said that they hadn't worked together since 9/11. They had three major issues dividing that community, the hot button issues, but also the whole issue of Israel-Palestine and the war in Iraq, because they have a large Jewish community and a large expat Palestinian community. And so for them to get together like that and to find the issues that they could work on together for the first time in 10 years was really empowering.
Now, Michael, you've just written a book in which you profile the meteoric rise of evangelicals in the areas of business, politics, media, and the academy. In your research, did you find that coalitions played a role in their rise to power? Or what types of coalitions did you come across in your interviews?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I did. I found that sort of the coalition-building enterprise among evangelicals had been fundamental to sort of them rising to the national stage. It was a way in which they sort of engaged the pluralistic public square in ways perhaps they hadn't done before, or at least more intentionally. And it's interesting because there's something that's unique about evangelicalism which really gives them an added advantage for some of this coalition building. For any movement, you have to have a core set of beliefs that unite everyone. This is the orthodoxy that has sort of held evangelicalism as a social movement together over the last 50 years. Core ideas about heaven, about hell, about God, the Bible. This orthodoxy really provides a sense of unity. Evangelicals share this same degree of orthodoxy with fundamentalists in many ways. Maybe they differ in degrees of conviction, but they share basic orienting kind of principles. But the difference between evangelicals and fundamentalists is that orthodoxy for fundamentalists becomes hard and brittle and easily broken when it rubs shoulders with other people. Whereas evangelicals have what I call elastic orthodoxy. It's durable. It's able to build and make bridges in different ways. They're not giving up their core convictions. So there's some people who say, evangelical Christians and culture have met and culture has triumphed. I interviewed 360 leaders in lots of different spheres, and they express very orthodox beliefs, very traditional notions of what evangelicals have often believed. The thing that I think that is different today than maybe what we've seen in the past is that evangelicals are quicker to extend their hand to work with other people, and I think it's that elastic orthodoxy which allows them not only to kind of build a sense of cohesion, but also build bridges across typical divides.
That question of elastic orthodoxy reminds me of the, I think it was Time Magazine's top 25 evangelicals included Richard John Newhouse, which is sort of an interesting idea that now kind of anyone who does things on behalf of their faith is an evangelical all of a sudden, which is an interesting way to picture it. But I'd like to turn to Tom and ask for your perspective on this rise of evangelical coalitions. Clearly, there are a lot of Catholics in America, and they've been really active in a lot of these. Could you characterize that for us?
Yeah, it is a new development, and Richard John Newhouse was one of the organizers of Evangelicals and Catholics Together, which was a theological document and also a very political document, and I think the same goes for the movement, wherever it is at this point. There's been cooperation among conservative Protestants and across the board and Catholics over the abortion issue and homosexuality. I think that one of the interesting, there are limits to it, though, I think, and historically, you look at the Christian Coalition effort to make to develop a Catholic branch, if you will, ran into some trouble. There were two reasons, I think. Well, we reported there were two reasons, and in interviews with bishops. One was because there weren't any bishops at the top. The second was because some bishops felt that so much of the rest of the Catholic social agenda was being left behind or short-circuited. So it's an interesting dynamic that goes on when there are these kinds of partnerships.
Now, Jim, you've been on the ground doing this type of organizing for decades. Could you tell us a little bit about, over the past 5 years, are you seeing a marked change? Are new types of coalitions forming, or is this just a lot of hype that the media is excited about, everyone holding hands?
First, I want to congratulate all of you. You have survived what we call panel stamina. So, Linda, they're all ready for Renaissance weekend. Let me tell you about last night. I was late this morning because of something last night. There was a global leaders forum in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the National Association of Evangelicals and Micah Challenge. This is the big global South group of evangelicals working on the Millennium Development Goals. It was a great evening because the Antichrist spoke last night to all these people. When I was growing up, the debate was, is the Antichrist the Pope or the UN? So Ban Ki-moon came and spoke last night to 250 evangelical leaders. So the Antichrist heard gospel music, talked about his personal faith, quoted Isaiah to cheers, and got a standing ovation. And this was not just the young evangelicals I talk about all the time and meet on the road. This is a lot of old guys. It was mostly older white men from the U.S. delegation, and then quite a selection of leaders all over the world. And what was clear is that global poverty and climate change are now on the mainstream of the evangelical agenda. That is demonstrably true now. So what Amy said today about the leveling of the playing field, I love that Time magazine quote. That's true. Democrats have, done some have done the math. Some have come out of the closet. Some are expressing their deeply held faith, and that will change things. But if Democrats were more faith-friendly, and the agenda wasn't changing in the evangelical community, none of that would matter at all. Because if you're only going to vote on two issues, then it won't change the dynamics. But the fact is, these newer evangelical agenda people are not and shouldn't be automatically liberal Democrats. Because people of faith shouldn't be in any party's political pocket. We should be the ultimate swing vote. And last night I saw, again, the potential. During the dinner, a guy walked over to me, and I know him, and he sat down. He's a religious right leader. And he was just bending my ear all night about the common ground that we have on a whole number of issues, and he wants to be in relationship on those. I have those conversations almost every week. There is a possibility of, when Richard and I went to the White House on Darfur, just the two of us, we met with the chief point person on Africa, he could say, I represent your constituency. The president really leads on this, we'll stand up and cheer and applaud. I could say, right after him, I don't represent your constituency. But if he leads on this, we'll stand up and applaud too. I think if a number of us from what has been called the religious left and right, which are terribly inaccurate categories, if we could agree on a number of key moral questions and ally ourselves together, we could shake and change American politics, which is more important than one party winning over the other.
Thanks. David, you've done a lot of research, particularly for your latest book on Christian, about attitudes of non-Christians to Christians in America. It seems that from all this excitement about these new coalitions, that non-Christians would be loving Christians, would be so excited that they're working on all these moral issues. Does your research corroborate that, or how does it speak to these coalitions?
Well, the title of the book is Unchristian, so that sort of answers the question. Actually, what we're finding from the data about young people outside the faith as non-Christians, 16 to 29, is that their perspectives about Christianity are more negative and hostile than they've been even a decade ago. So you could look at young people 16 to 29, and they are 8 times less favorable towards evangelicals than were boomer non-Christians just 14, 15 years ago. So there is actually quite a bit of polarization, and I think a lot of these debates, one of the things that was really interesting is we asked young people, what is your perspective on all these different kinds of things about Christianity, your images, and the top perception of Christians today is that we're anti-homosexual. And if you go through all these different kinds of perspectives, the way that young people describe Christianity today is that we're known for all the things that we're against rather than the things that we're for. And, sort of provide a little bit different perspective about coalition building with young people, one of the interesting things I think we ought to consider is that even with non-Christians, young people who are non-Christians, many of them have actually been in a church. They say they have 5 friends who are Christians. Many of them considered becoming a Christian in the past. And one of the things I think we need to think about is not sort of getting young people rallied around politics every 2 or 4 years to come out for election, but how do we use their natural proclivity and their natural spiritual inclination during the teen years and start to cultivate the right kinds of political attitudes, the right kinds of dialogue with people? I mean, a very simple example would be if our churches were to spend time discussing with other churches of different ethnicities, like where I'm from in California. I happen to attend a fairly diverse church, but there's the black church, there's the Hispanic church, and there's very little discussion about how politics relates to all of these things. So I think a very critical thing for churches to do is invest in young people. They should be more political, not less. And by that, I don't mean that we should give them a voting card. I think during the week-to-week engagement that young people spend with our churches, we need to be talking about, all right, you need to be involved in this cause. What is a cause that really floats your boat? What are the things that you ought to be getting invested in? And how do you think about that as a person of faith? How does your Christian faith address all of these needs and challenges that you face? And as Christians, one of the things that we learned from this whole study was that there tends to be a sort of a negative reaction on the part of most churches to pursuing the margins of society, pursuing people that are different from them, having a reasonable conversation about that. Again, I think it's an attitude with young people that we need to cultivate, is this willingness to pursue the margins when we're getting them involved within the political and social sphere.
Thanks. David, I'll turn to you down here. In an article that you wrote called Voters and Values, which is surprisingly similar to our conference title, you wrote, quote, "But another element within the religious left is deeply uneasy about bringing religion directly into the political sphere. It doubts that a knockdown political fight about what God wants is good for religion or politics. The fact that the religious right is so eager for that fight is just what the religious left finds scary." How does this hesitancy among the religious left you've identified play into our conversation about the formation of coalitions?
I guess I see this a little bit in generational terms. We talked a bit about generations today. I think that my sense is that there was a generation for whom being a Christian liberal was being the Democratic Party at prayer. And I think that my sense is that a number of subsequent generations whose focus is on nurturing the faith in congregations, embodying the faith, their political witness comes out of that. And so they're less interested in some of the old conflicts or the old ways of identifying themselves as what it means to be a liberal Christian.
Well, I'd now like to push a little bit into thinking of areas for growth, where we might be able to build these types of consensuses. And some of the areas we've heard about, most of us know, include relief and development, international human rights, religious freedom. We've heard the environment and poverty and immigration. And I'd love to hear from you all, particularly from the activists, the areas that you're most excited about trying to forge a new coalition around. And Lisa, I thought we might start with you. You run New York Faith and Justice, whose mission statement reads, "Following Christ, uniting the church, and ending poverty in New York through spiritual formation, education, and direct advocacy." Tell us about what you're most excited about in this coalition building.
I'm very, very excited. We actually just had our launch a week and a half ago, and Jim came and spoke for us, and it was amazing. We had about 300 people who showed up, mainly just from emails that got sent out all throughout New York City. New York is a very secular city. It's extremely secular. I don't remember the exact percentage now, but it's an extremely low percentage of New Yorkers who call themselves evangelicals. And it's also a highly political city, very political, and a big power base for the entire world. The UN is right there. I think what we realized is that the typical players always show up at all the same marches, and they're usually the progressives or the liberals, liberal Christians or progressive Christians, Catholics, but the evangelicals were just almost never there. And what we realized is, well, we are all evangelicals, and we have the 4 people who originally started New York Faith and Justice. We had our feet in multiple worlds. We were bridge people. So we decided, well, let's build a bridge. Let's build a bridge and call everybody to it so that we can speak out with one voice about one thing, about poverty. And what we realized in the last week or so since our launch is that there is a huge felt need for this in the city. We went back and did a data entry party right after that night. Literally got on our computers and entered all the data from our response cards. 150 people responded. 71 people signed up to volunteer or intern. And 85 people wanted to pray. And there were it's an inordinate number for a very first interface with the organization or the movement. But it's important to know this is not just New York. There's actually Boston, the Boston Faith and Justice Network. There's lots of these movements rising up across the country in order to move forward and build coalitions. And what we found is that evangelicals are eager. They're actually eager to engage. But the problem has been a lack of leadership among evangelicals who will actually on a local level, take responsibility for moving them out of the pews and into the streets, or out of the pews and into dealing with issues of policy that affect people other than themselves.
And if I could say, Union Seminary and Campus Crusade for Christ were both in the house that night. That's like the Crips and the Bloods, man.
Yeah.
You know? And the crowd was more than half under 30, and there was teenage kids, 18, 19-year-olds. And it was very, very multicultural. It was in the South Bronx. And it was a glimpse of the future. It really was.
Now, Tyler, you're out on the ground working on coalition building around an interesting issue that doesn't come up on a lot of people's short list. Tell us a little bit about your organization.
Well, as one of the 2 single-issue people on this panel, I'm delighted that it's the consensus of this event that we should abolish nuclear weapons. And I'll look forward to getting all your names for a petition. I work for Faithful Security. I share the leadership of that organization, and we're dedicated to the abolition of nuclear weapons. There has been, speaking of the reason that I'm working and that I'm able to do this work right now is because of coalition building, but it's on the secular side that has led the show. There was an op-ed in January in the Wall Street Journal by George Shultz, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn, and Henry Kissinger arguing that we need to move urgently toward a nuclear weapons-free world. Henry Kissinger has since defended that statement in public. So that has enabled a whole set of, this is no longer sort of, yeah, I'd like it if there were fairies and unicorns too, but we live in the world. Yeah, this is real stuff. Moving toward nuclear weapon elimination. I'm not going to run through the logic of it right now because I want people to hang out with me after the event, and when I do, people tend to turn gray and forget my name. But so it really has been, this work has come out of building coalitions to begin with. I have 3 points that I'd like to say, but I think the last one refers or will speak more to the red flag, so I just want to red flag it so I can come back to it. One is I think there are 2 kinds of coalitions that we might want to pay attention to, and both, I'm encountering both with Faithful Security. One is issue coalitions. So I deal with nuclear weapons. I deal only with nuclear weapons. I wake up thinking about them. I go to bed thinking about them. I dream about them, and it's what I spend my day doing. And you must be delighting in the fact that you're not married to me. One of the ways that we're getting some traction on this is questions of environmental justice. So I think we're seeing, especially in the evangelical community, a more holistic social conscience. And so one of the ways, it's like nuclear weapons aren't just about security, they're about the environment, they're about the poor, etc. The other form of coalition is this, we all live in the same planet. What a wake-up call. And so there's this sense of the common good, this recent statement from Third Way that came out this week, where people are realizing, look, we have common ground. We've all got to live together. And so we're going to... So we being diverse and maybe unlikely bedfellows are going to band together and work on things that we share in common.
Thanks. Well, it brings up an interesting question of what these coalitions actually look like. I think to those that are not part of them, the image is that all of these people of different faiths, or at least different stripes of Christianity, are coming together, they've forged this coalition, and now they're working on this list of 10 issues. But I imagine it's a little more complicated. Perhaps groups convene around one particular issue, but as they move on to another issue, they lose a few and they pick up a few. Can anyone offer us, anyone that wants to speak to this, what do these coalitions look like that you're part of? Do you have partners? Do you have partners that you work with continuously on a lot of issues? Are there particular issues that only unite a few people? What do these coalitions look like? Any takers?
We are new, so I only have very limited experience to really speak from in a tangible way, but I will say that we have 2 different initiatives that we're working on this year, and one of them is environmental justice, and the other one is poverty-related violence. We were actually spurred into action. Our very first action was in response to the Bell shootings that happened in New York City, 50 shots. And we started with 2 separate things, 2 on-ramps into the movement. One was a prayer vigil that would definitely garner the support of evangelicals who, if there's one thing we can do, we can pray, right? So prayer vigil brought out evangelicals, mostly white and Asian, who came and they prayed against violence. And then they prayed for a forum that was happening in the South Bronx that was mostly black and brown, black and Latino. And they were talking about violence in the neighborhood and actually asking the question of how do we deal with it. Well, out of that forum came a coalition that has been coming together. And now the whole movement is on board with that. In a practical sense, the environmental justice piece, we're working specifically with one law agency in the city that is really kind of pressing this forward. And we're partnering with them because we like their tactics, we like what they're doing, what they're saying.
I would say I would change the language a bit from coalitions, which are important, to movement and movements, because I think you've got a number of interconnected movements here. And you don't go to everyone on the same issue, but it really all comes out of relationships. I mean, I remember Richard and I went to, the first time we spoke at Davos, the World Economic Forum, reception the first night. We both walk in. Neither of us, at least I didn't know many in that CEO crowd at Davos. I saw a familiar face, Richard Land. And we sat and talked for an hour and a half at that reception. And somebody who's with us, I would have loved to have taped that conversation. We talked about the Supreme Court, we talked about Iraq, we talked about human rights in Darfur. And out of relationship, you begin to sense who the other person is, what they're concerned about, and where you agree and where you don't. And where the common ground is critical to find. And where we don't have common ground, we can demonstrate a kind of civility that politics doesn't really demonstrate these days. So I think part of it's relationship building and networks and kind of interfacing groups and people who know where the common ground is and can pounce on it pretty quickly when the time calls for that.
I think that there are a lot of shifting coalitions, and they differ by issue. But I think the real seismic shift has happened in the last decade, and I think it's indicated by, I know when Jim's book first came out, I went to the Brookings Institution. Jim may remember this. And I said, well, the first thing I want to say is that there's been a debate going on in the United States for the last 15 or 20 years about whether people should bring their faith to bear on public policy. That debate is now over. It was won by people who say that we can and we should, and it's an invaluable resource. And now we can sit down and argue about how it should be applied. And that's what Jim and I are going to do now. We're going to argue about the best way to apply our faith. But, you know, for instance, the gambling issue was mentioned this morning. People come together to oppose gambling who are never in the same room on the same side. And for sometimes differing reasons, but we both realize, both people who come at it because we believe it's a social evil and people who think it's just a horribly regressive tax on the least fortunate, we come together to fight that. And my mother, who was raised in Boston, I made the mistake of sending her a picture of me with Senator Kennedy when I had testified before his committee, because we strongly support Senator Kennedy's bill to say that the Food and Drug Administration ought to be able to regulate a drug that kills 400,000 people a year, namely tobacco. That we not ban it, just regulate it, like we regulate all the products that help you quit smoking. They are covered by the FDA, but tobacco isn't. And my mother wanted to know if Washington was finally getting to me, because I was actually supporting Senator Kennedy and had my picture taken with him. So it is a shifting coalition, but the seismic shift, I think, that's occurred in my lifetime and Jim's lifetime, because we both came to maturity in the 60s, is that really a majority of Americans say, you know, we have a lot of vexing issues that we face as a society. And to say that we ought to segregate people's religious beliefs from how we can address those issues is, as Joseph Lieberman has said, both an unnatural and an unnecessary act.
Melissa?
I just wanted to ask about, in these coalitions, on the one hand, it sounds like there are already people who share a common goal. But what about when you have a new issue and you're trying to build a coalition? What's going to be the source of authority for that, right? So that if you're all Christians, one still can talk theologically, presumably. But if it's interfaith coalitions, or if it's secular and faithful coalitions, then there's even just trying to figure out to what do we appeal. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, one that comes to mind is the coalition that has built around trying to protect our society to some degree from pornography. And there you have the Muslim tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Jewish tradition. All are in agreement on this issue. And they're in the room with feminist groups who understand that this is dehumanizing to women. And so we come together on both the issue and how it objectivizes over half the human race, and at the same time, the terrible damage that it causes in society. And so it depends on the issue, but you find that people come to these issues often from differing perspectives, but they still say this is really destructive to our society, and we need to find ways to address it.
You take the wisdom from the last panel. There's a lot of good things said in the last panel. Apply it to your question. How that when you say, I believe what I believe because of my faith, when I get to the public square, I make a moral turn. And I don't use sectarian language to say this. You don't say, it's a Judeo-Christian country, so I get to win. King never said that. He had to win a debate. He had to persuade his fellow citizens, Baptist or Catholic or Jew or not, that a Voting Rights Act in 65 was good for the country. You got to win the common good argument. And that's where I think we have a common moral conversation. And I think what I love at our events is that often secular people come after us and say, I didn't feel kicked to the curb tonight because you said we need a moral discourse on politics, something we all need and are all needed for. The more we can help to fire and catalyze and even lead an inclusive conversation on those big issues, the more we can invite lots of people into it.
You want to hop in, David?
I just have a quick comment. In our study of young people, one of the really interesting things, I think that new coalitions are actually being empowered by technology to a degree that we don't fully appreciate. I've got a good friend who has an organization called To Write Love on her arms, and it's to help people that are cutting, that are actually hurting themselves, self-injurers. And he's got tens of thousands of people who are part of his little network on MySpace. And so people are actually being... One of the things we actually had a discussion this morning or this afternoon around lunch around the fact that young people aren't using... where are they getting their news? They're getting them from television, they're getting it online. I'd make the argument that they're not actually getting news. They feel like they're participating in news. And so there's a fundamental shift not only in the technological tools that they use, but also their desire to participate in reality and to participate in solving these problems. They don't feel like they're just a voter or just a person that needs to be messaged to. They feel like they can actually create a message, create a solution, be part of the process of ending some of these problems or at least rescuing people. And again, I think that the value of technology is really being, it's really creating some of these new connection points for people.
Yeah, that makes me think about a new strategy that really seems to be employed by a number of these coalitions, and that is media and entertainment, particularly among evangelicals. There have been a slew of organizations. So we see media outlets like Walden Media, producer of Chronicles of Narnia, Mark Rogers' Clapham Group, the Modern Wilberforce Movement, Amazing Grace, and the documentary The Better Hour, and even Mako Fujimura with the International Arts Movement. And some of these people are following the line that they believe that culture is upstream from politics. So as people are frustrated with the partisan rancor, they look to these new media outlets to change the hearts and the minds instead of the votes of the people. Michael, in your book, you write, evangelicals have discovered that Hollywood is an outstanding stage from which to carry out their mission to change the world. How does this trend fit into our broader discussion about coalitions? And maybe you'll offer us the Inside Edition story as part of that.
Yeah, so this was one of the things I wasn't expecting when I set out to do the interviews. My expectation was that evangelicals would be really excited about activity in Washington and that this would be the central playing field where they felt like that they had made the biggest impact and that because of that they were all the more excited to keep making an impact. In fact, I found that there were many folks who had spent a long time in Washington who were disillusioned, feeling that they hadn't quite gotten all that they had hoped for. And then a whole slew of other people who came to the conclusion that arts, entertainment, and media was a mechanism by which they could bring about cultural change and sort of keep themselves out of the political rancor that bothered some of them. And I was struck, I did, 360 interviews, but I bet a couple of dozen people spoke positively to me about the gay and lesbian movement of the last 30 years. And in particular, the way in which the gay and lesbian community had done something that they perceived to be effective and that many of these evangelicals said, we want to sort of adopt some of these same strategies. Specifically, using entertainment as a way of sort of getting your message across in subtle, sympathetic ways. So creating, for example, a sympathetic character on a major television show who is gay, but that's not the full person. It's not a cardboard cutout. Or having a movie like Philadelphia or other things like that. And in Hollywood, this certainly has been something I heard time and again, how a number of folks who are writers, directors, and producers were saying that what has worked for the gay and lesbian movement, we think can also work for the evangelical movement. I interviewed a woman named Barbara Nicolosi, who runs a program called Act One. She's actually a former nun, so she shows how sort of evangelicals and Catholics have worked together in interesting ways. And this Act One program basically takes young, recent college graduates, trains them in sort of the craft of screenwriting in an intensive summer program, and gives them mentoring relationships with really accomplished writers, producers, directors who share their faith convictions. So you have this kind of shared faith, and you have an older generation sort of training the next generation. And it's become really popular. It's quite selective, and a lot more attention's been given to it. So Nicolosi was asked to appear on Inside Edition to talk about this and talk about this particular group. And she says to the producer, you know, I never thought in my wildest dreams I would be asked to come here on your TV show and to talk about my faith and Act One and how my faith informs, you know, what I think is going on in Hollywood. And she said, you know, I know there have been lots of different ways in which there have been developments, but this was really surprising to me. And the producer said to her, don't you know, Christian is the new gay. And I thought that sort of encapsulated a lot of the interesting things I'd seen.
I'd now like to push us a little bit to our final discussion, although we still have a good bit of time left. And this is what I'm calling fault lines for the consensus. Because I'm a little worried that there's a lot of rosy talk about coalition building, but when the rubber hits the road, when you translate these shared biblical ethics into questions of public policy, people actually have very different ideas about what public policies help best realize those ethical commitments. So first, I want to look at domestic poverty and welfare. We might say, look, everyone agrees that the Bible is serious about poverty, that we are commanded to feed, to clothe, and to house, but what does that actually look like in public policy? And I want to first turn to Marvin Olasky, who has written extensively about compassionate conservatism. And I'd be curious to hear his, I think he describes it or has relations to the sort of Niebuhrian realism. How do you take the biblical command to care for the poor seriously, and what does that look like in public policy?
Yeah, I do have to add a skeptical note to what we're hearing here. We're almost proclaiming a new era of good feeling, and yet the divides are huge. Just give you one example on poverty fighting. We've heard already today, and it's certainly one of the most frequently quoted verses. It's a wonderful verse from Matthew 25 about as you do to the least of these, you do to me, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and so forth. There's a different perspective on that same verse. Namely, look at the effects of certain actions. If, in fact, what you did to the least of these, you do to me, if, let's say, you take actions that amount to providing or facilitating drug use by some folks, then it is the equivalent of sticking heroin into Jesus' veins. In other words, there's a negative side of this too that's possible as well as the positive side. It's not as if the goal is just to do something. The question is, what are the effects of this in real life? What do we know about the effects of this in real life? And how can we be truly charitable and truly compassionate rather than doing something that makes us feel good but may actually hurt the people we are purporting to help? So there's a huge divide on this. And it's a divide it can be overcome because we can look at what exactly happens in real life, but it's not something that we can just wax sentimental over. It's a huge divide, and we have to pay careful attention to what exactly programs do, what works, and what doesn't work. And we see the same thing in some other areas, too. I mean, it's great to say, okay, no nukes. Well, what do we do if there are nukes in Iran? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of practical policy? So these are the types of questions that go on. I think we're probably all generally agreed now that global warming is for real, but there's still a real debate about how much humans contribute to it and what do you do about it. There is a Scandinavian environmentalist, Bjorn Lornborg, who's written a couple of books, one called The Skeptical Environmentalist, one called Cool It, where he, from a point of view of how do we most help the poor, is actually very skeptical and even critical of some of the programs to fight global warming because he says these are not going to be very effective. You could do a lot more to really help the poor with here are the types of programs in terms of fighting diseases, providing pure water and so forth. You could do a lot more with those funds rather than spend a huge amount of money for something that, at least from his perspective, is not going to be accomplishing all that much because he sees humans as contributing to this but only a small amount and there's other things going on. So on some of these issues, again, we can have an era of good feeling, but there are real obstacles here. Now, can I just, well, let me just one other thing. I think the hopeful sign here is that one of the real tragedies of American Protestantism, at least over the past century, is now finally coming to an end. A century ago, I'll try to do 100 years in 100 seconds. A century ago, you started to have the growth of the social gospel movement, which had great intentions. A lot of people on the conservative spectrum started to say, well, no, that's taking it in a different direction. It's taking it, in fact, away from evangelism. And the social gospel movement was for heavy involvement in the cities, and so there were a lot of conservative evangelicals who said, we're not going to pay attention to the cities. We're going to retreat into our own fortresses. We're going to be in rural areas, later suburbs and exurbs and so forth. We don't care about the cities. And there was also that sense of, well, this is good, the social gospel movement cares about the poor. We're really not going to pay a whole lot of attention to that. And so you had this divide, which became the modernist fundamentalist divide and has led to all sorts of bad repercussions for decades. That's changing now. You're seeing conservative evangelicals no longer content to be out in the suburbs and the exurbs and the rural areas. You see conservative evangelicals really working in the city. This is hugely important. Tim Keller, for example, the Redeemed Presbyterian Church in New York, has been doing this. There's one quick story. 10 years ago, there's a small Christian college located in a beautiful pastoral area north of New York City that's failing. And the board of directors at that point, it's called the King's College, the board of directors at that point decides to close it down, sell that land, and use the money to take out a long-term lease in the Empire State Building and have the kids living there right in the middle of New York, exposed to everything that New Yorkers are exposed to, with the goal of having kids grow to love the city. This is a conservative evangelical thrust into New York City, not in the attempt of trying to subjugate the city, but teach kids to love the city, work in the city, pray for the city, and for its benefit, and we'll all prosper in that way. These things are happening and these things are changing, but it's still a real struggle.
Let's stick with the poverty issue just for a minute, because I think this raises the possibility that if all we do is educate Christians about the biblical commands to feed, to clothe, and to house, it doesn't necessarily follow that they would support, for example, federal welfare programs or the expansion of these entitlement or social services programs. So I'd love to direct this to you, Jim, as you talk about your book and you're out there talking with people, some of the issues that you're involved in, for example, on the S-chip debate. What do you do with Christians who respond, look, I take it just as seriously as you do, but my understanding of the public policy that flows from that is just different than yours?
Well, I think there's almost a hierarchy of issues, ones that are easier and ones that are tougher. Global poverty is the easiest because most Americans think that kids who are poor overseas, it's not their fault. You know, there's a lot of kids who are poor and they're born poor, it's not their fault. And trade, aid, and debt are the template you have to crack. And even on that, there's more sense of we don't just need more aid, but more effective aid. Transparency is important. Governance is important. Rule of law. Debt cancellation now almost universally is seen to be important. And on the trade issues, even though the Farm Bill is going nowhere, most people around the world know that the kind of subsidies we pay to rich farmers, which don't allow African cotton farmers to earn their way out of poverty, finally are going to have to be changed. Aid won't be enough, you got to earn your way out of poverty. Domestic poverty is harder because in this country people feel like if you're poor in America, there must be something wrong with you. And the truth is, there are things wrong in family systems and structures and culture. And, you know, I think we're closer to than we've been before, a grand alliance between liberals who start talking seriously about family breakdown, about sexual integrity, out-of-wedlock birth, who talk about those things as liberals, and conservatives who are persuaded to make strategic investments in healthcare, education, and housing. And putting the old arguments aside, a lot of things we've done didn't work. But how do you meld personal and social responsibility? The big issue, and where Richard and I disagree most probably, is going to be, I think, the hardest ones are the war and peace issues. America's role in the world. I think American exceptionalism is a nice way to speak about American empire. And we have a debate about that. It's not just different in Iraq. It's about what the American role in the world should be. Unilateral, unipolar, versus multilateral, multipolar. So I think there are some important principal issues. Then you get to S-chip. We've talked about S-chip on the phone actually quite a bit lately. And, the bill isn't perfect. I think there's enough of a bipartisan consensus that it's a step forward, but it's not perfect. And the immigration bill was even less perfect. And the farm bill is a mess. So how do you separate principles that we can agree to from legitimate prudential judgment differences on whether this policy or that bill can move us forward or not? And those, I think, we have to give each other space to have differences in whether this policy is a step forward or not.
Just to Randy and then to Richard.
Actually, I'm looping back to Marvin's comments. I think, Marvin, you were too timid. I want to advance a radically conservative idea, policy proposal. I'm not usually accused of being a conservative. And that has to do with welfare. I mean, conservatives regularly complain about welfare, how much money, government money, taxpayer money is going to welfare. Well, in American history, in the 19th century, up until the Great Depression, churches and religious organizations took responsibility for welfare. Look at any small, medium-sized city in this country. You've got a Baptist hospital or a Methodist hospital, Mercy Hospital, and so forth. I would love to see religious organizations taking advantage of their long-standing tax exemptions resume that responsibility for social welfare. Now, I'm not talking about faith-based initiatives, because that's the taxpayers' money they're distributing. But religious organizations, rather than leveling another acre of trees to build a glitzy new megachurch, put their money into people, welfare relief. That may mean for older congregations, liberal, mainline congregations, redirecting some of their endowment funds for that purpose. That, to me, is a radically conservative idea.
Well, looking back to the poverty issue, first of all of you, if you haven't read, should read Arthur Brooks' book, Who Really Cares, professor at Syracuse University, who points out he was so shocked by his research, he went back and did it again to make sure he hadn't made a mistake. And he found that people who go to worship services, particularly people who are conservative, who go to worship services every week, give more of their own income to charities, both religious and secular, and to the alleviation of suffering, than people who are more liberal and people who don't go to church. They give to secular and religious charities at a higher rate. As a result, the one good thing that Mississippi is number one in is that Mississippi, in spite of not being a very wealthy state, the people of Mississippi give a higher percentage of their own income to both secular and religious charities than any other state in the country. I think that I got Stephen Carter's permission to say this, to repeat it, because he said it at Aspen, and I thought it was something that needed to be said, but that's off the record, so I had to get permission. He said that he really despaired that we were in the near term going to solve the problem of poverty, particularly poverty in the inner city. And he said the reason is, he said the Democrats are not willing to acknowledge and don't care about some of the social dysfunctions that are causing poverty in the inner city, and Republicans aren't willing to spend enough money on the problem. And I think that both have been to a degree true, and I think that what you see in these kinds of coalitions is an attempt to bridge that gap. Now, Jim also talked about American exceptionalism. I do believe in American exceptionalism, but to me it's a doctrine of service, it's a doctrine of sacrifice, it's a doctrine of responsibility in the cause of freedom. We don't have the right to impose freedom on other countries, but I do believe we have an obligation to do everything we can to share it and to help others achieve it who want it. I don't believe it's a Western ideal. I believe freedom is a universal ideal and a universal value. I don't think we should automatically act unilaterally. We should always try to work through the international agencies or through multilateral agencies. But I do agree with President Clinton when he said that the biggest regret of his presidency in public policy was that he didn't intervene in Rwanda. The killing rate in Rwanda was higher than it was in the death camps of the Nazis. We could have stopped somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million human beings from being hacked to death with machetes and hoes. And we could have done it with a battalion of Marines. And if no one would have gone with us, we still should have done it.
Let's table the international issues because we're going to turn to that after the poverty. But on the poverty question, Jen, do you want to hop in on that?
Sure. I mean, just an observation. I think that you've really hit the nail on the head with this line of questioning, and it's been interesting to watch the responses from Richard Land and Jim Wallis, because I think it demonstrates what happens when we get together across these divides and talk about these issues in a new way. I feel like a lot of the policy debates in the United States have been still sort of defined by the conflicts of the 60s and 70s, and that we haven't moved past that. And yet what we're saying happens in these coalitions around AIDS, sex trafficking, is that we begin to work together, we build relationships, we build trust, but we also get outside the box of our narrow policy solutions that right and left have been proposing for years. And I think a conversation like that is especially needed around poverty and around family, in particular looking at what young families are facing today. I think there's a perfect storm coming for families, and I see it in my church, I see it in my neighborhood, I see it in the numbers and in the economy, and that there are solutions that go beyond these sort of left-right divides in the ways that we defined them in the past. I mean, one way, to look at that is through the tax system and such, and everybody can agree that we want less taxes. So changing the tax code for families and those kinds of things are start in places where liberals and conservatives start to agree.
Let's go back to Randy's point, which I think is an interesting proposal and something that you hear among conservatives that talk about civil society, and they'll look back maybe to the 1950s or even to the 1800s and say, look, before we had a massive federal welfare state, it was communities and churches and even secular local organizations that provided these services. This is some of the rhetoric around compassionate conservatism, that someone donating their own time, they benefit from it, they can communicate love and feeling and affection, and this anonymous government employee doesn't do any of those things. So that's a conservative proposal that you hear a lot, but it doesn't seem like that's really getting a lot of ground. Marvin, do you want to talk about that idea?
Yeah, I think it is getting a lot of ground. You don't see it getting a lot of attention. You don't see it getting a lot of press attention. But, I mean, we've been covering in World this for years, and we're seeing much more of it. I mean, we're seeing congregations, for example, that say, we're not going to build a new sanctuary until an orphanage is built in Africa. And there are a lot of examples of that, and we tell stories on it, but it's not getting into the general news, and I'm not quite sure why.
I'm still looking for a broader-based coordinated proposal that would effectively end welfare, not as we know it, but end it entirely, and let the religious groups resume that responsibility in American society. What happened historically, of course, is that religious groups were responsible for that, and then, of course, the social problems of the Great Depression were just simply so overwhelming that the government had to step in. But I'm looking for religious groups to resume that responsibility in this society.
Well, let me say, one way to start on this would be to really understand and emphasize the role of religious groups when there are disasters like Hurricane Katrina. Sure. The religious groups did a fantastic job there. I mean, Southern Baptists, Salvation Army, they got there first and were universally praised by the same folks who were saying that government at all levels, local, state, and federal, failed. So let's, in our planning, let's say those groups are first responders. Let's put the emphasis there and let's help them do an even more effective job and look to them. That's the start.
I think it is, and that's why I said to you we had a talk. We haven't talked in a while because I think that is true about New Orleans, what I said in the earlier panel, but churches can't rebuild levees. So what are the structural things that are common good things that governments have to be part of? Churches can't provide health care for 47 million Americans. We just can't do that. So a big part of poverty in America is health care, a big chunk. Another is affordable housing. In Denver right now, if you got to work 80 hours a week at minimum wage to afford any kind of housing in Denver, and Denver isn't the worst market. So there are structural issues. Tax code is a great one. Tax code, if we dealt with some, education is one. What we call education for kids in my neighborhood, I would call it crime against non-white kids. You know, it's a crime. And yet we imprison kids every day in these school systems and we just argue about vouchers. And yet these kids are being re-imprisoned every day, and they're going to prison, and it's costing us the equivalent, I heard on NPR yesterday, of a Harvard education to keep every one of them in prison. So there are some structural things that we couldn't do. But I think, Randall's right. If we could deal with the structural questions and then the church is re-engaged in the way you're right, I see those little stories too.
Well, could I suggest a radical proposal then? One of the differences between what happened in the past with churches and what's happening at present is that tens, actually hundreds of billions of dollars are absorbed by Health and Human Services and other groups in a very ineffective way. What if you could take some of that money and have, let's say, starting in a very modest way, a $500 tax credit, where individuals could take $500, send it to the poverty-fighting organization of their choice, religious, non-religious, whatever, and take that off their taxes, and $500 less going to Health and Human Services, $500 more going to local poverty-fighting groups. Would you be in favor of such a proposal?
I think churches already get quite a bit of tax break. Let them use that for welfare. Why not?
But that's the big difference between the situation now and the situation in the past, where so much money is taken and used for ineffective programs that actually, more than ineffective, programs that actually damage.
All right, let's get a proposal from religious groups to take over those responsibilities. Not with taxpayer money, but with their own money that they have from tax breaks.
Just to follow up on that, that's a really interesting point about taxpayer money, because President Bush's faith-based initiative is, in one sense, working to rebuild civil society, but a civil society funded with taxpayer dollars. How does that, Marvin, how does that shake out for you? So it's taxpayer dollars supporting what, Tocqueville loved, coming out of people's private philanthropy.
Again, we're not starting from a pure state in which people are not being taxed. We're starting from a situation where hundreds of billions of dollars are being used in a very ineffective way. And why do we keep using that? In other words, let me ask people in the audience here, with say, a modest proposal like this $500. How many of you, if you wanted to maximize the effectiveness in fighting poverty, and you had a choice between sending it to a local poverty-fighting group that you know does a good job, or sending it to Washington, how many of you would send that money to Washington, that $500?
Tyler, do you want to hop in on that real quick?
Well, I don't want to derail this, but I do feel the need to raise one fault line that I feel like hasn't been addressed. And an aside, I would actually, while I wholeheartedly support the structural work that Sojourners and other groups are doing to address poverty at the governmental level, I would issue a challenge to the church and say, actually, if we love Jesus as much as we say we do, we absolutely could provide health care for 47 million Americans. That is, if we are at least 3/4 of the population, we are staggeringly wealthy. If we really cared about Jesus as much as we say we do, we could do it. But that's an aside. The fault line that I wanted to raise, that's a neat bit of rhetoric, isn't it? The fault line that I wanted to raise, rather than sort of the issue of how the coalitions build, my previous comments were as a political activist. These comments are coming as an ordained Baptist preacher. And I am, I'm deeply concerned about the hegemony that political thinking exerts over the religious imagination. We're here gathered together, and the common theme is politics, but the big elephant in the room is that, for the most part, the panelists and the participants are Christians. So speaking as a Christian to, I realize not all Christians, but some Christians I assume are at least here. I am worried that this coalition building, though it will be very good for government, may actually be very bad for the church. And the reason I think it might be very bad for the church is because it cements the conviction that religion, or Christianity to put it specifically, is morals. That's what faith is, values and morals, which seems to me such an impoverished notion of what it means to trust in the living God, that I fear we're caving, and that the result, that what we're losing is the fact that politics is witness, that Christian politics has to be witness. And so, for example, what I want to see in terms of coalition building is, yes, Rabbi Saperstein's group is a member of our coalition. Sojourners is a member of our coalition. Christian groups and Muslim groups are a member of our coalition because we all stand for the same common good, and that's a good thing. But speaking as a minister, you don't need a crucified Savior not to want to get blown up. So what are we saying? You know, and I don't need a crucified Savior not to want to blow up other people. Isn't that just human? I mean, isn't this just the lowest we can ask of our government, that it's good? The reason, finally, that I am able to reconcile this kind of work with my ordination vows and the charge is because I believe that circumstances are such that if we fail to act, the name of my crucified Savior will be blasphemed among the peoples because of me, because of our failure to act. So it's for the glory of God. And if we can't distinguish, I think it's great that we come together for this common ground, but if we don't then return to our own communities and understand out of the depths of our own traditions and using the depths of our own resources and speak out of our own integrity, then we are giving the wealth of the faith over to fallen powers. And I'm really inspired by Richard Nathan gave us the benediction this morning, and I'll leave us with this, but it's from Colossians 1, this glorious hymn. And it says that these powers and thrones, they were made through Christ, and they were made for Christ, and in him all things hold together. So I'm deeply suspicious of using religion to achieve politics as if that was the highest fruit of the gospel, as if that's where it stops. And so I just want to note, that hasn't been what we were talking about, but I think it's tremendously important and something not to be forgotten as we proceed.
Jim, do you want to answer that?
I agree with that, but I was raised in a little church where their theme verse was, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whosoever believes," was crucified Lord. They forgot the first part, "For God so loved the world." And the crucified Lord had nothing to do with the rest of the world. And they told me the Sermon on the Mount was not for this dispensation. "Blessed are the peacemakers." That was for heaven, they told me. I was only 15. I said, I think we need it now. You know? So I meet young people all over the place. They're not, you're exactly right. They don't want a bunch of morals or common denominators, but they want their faith to make a difference in their lives and their world. So this is all driving them back to their faith. But the faith has to mean something in the world, or else they don't want a faith that's just about them and the Lord, about what they shouldn't do, and please be as nice as you can. That just doesn't fire the imagination.
Tom? I just want to, I totally agree, but I think that the end then needs to be the church. I'm not trying to, solipsism.
Tom?
Well, I just want to make 2 points about the whole issue of fighting poverty. I think, first, as a society, one has to look at where you're spending your money. And if it's over $500 billion a year on straight military spending, $8 billion a month on open-ended wars, we are defining ourselves. And I think we're talking about what's important to us without almost any questions. There are almost no questions about that. If there were even a tenth of the questions raised about that kind of spending as are raised about, welfare problems, we might be having a great conversation. The second thing is that I think that when we talk about churches taking over those social welfare functions, part of the problem, and I count myself among them, in that problem, is that we've moved away from our conversation with people who need to be helped. Now, Sojourners does it with a certain authority because you've stayed, but I think that there's a sense in which our churches have not countered the culture at all, but moved with it, and we've distanced ourselves from people who need help, from people who are poor, from people who are of different color, and I think there's a deeper issue there than who's going to raise the money and how it's going to be spread around.
Richard, and then David, just real quick.
Well, I think I was raised in a faith tradition, the Southern Baptist, where I heard routinely from the pulpit. Now, we're Southern Baptists. That means we don't get involved in anything controversial. We just preach the gospel. Well, of course, the gospel, by its essence and nature, is controversial, and sooner or later is going to offend everybody. And what they meant by that, of course, was we're not going to get involved in anything that might smack of government intervention or anything that might smack of integration. That's what it meant when I heard it. When I was a teenager. And I think a whole generation of evangelicals has rejected that and said, look, we're commanded to be salt and light, and it comes out of our faith. It is not a replacement for our faith. It's not our faith, but it comes out of our faith. And I'm sure that most of us, and I know Jim thinks this, we're not in this because it's politics. We're seeking to help define and to help influence America's public policy. Now, you do that through political parties. But what I'm hoping is that people of faith are going to make Democrats better Democrats. They're going to make Republicans better Republicans. They're going to make independents better independents. And we're going to make it a better country.
To David?
Just quickly, I'm all for civil society and the kind of things that Marvin is stressing and is provocatively stressed. But I just want to counter Randy's narrative a little bit, because it seems to me that the collapse of civil society and all the things that churches used to do in this culture, I mean, it was industrialization, mobility, a highly differentiated society that made churches, and a lack of local community, that made churches no longer had the capacity to do this. They weren't doing it. Somebody had to do it. And so this is the situation, as I read history, that we see this is something that actually the broader political community now needs to do. It needs to do what it can do.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the issue of medical care and health care is probably something that no religious organization can take on. So if we could bracket that out and let religious organizations take up the rest, give it a shot.
Lisa, one last note.
Yeah, I think, as I look at the situation on the political ground, something that has just been bugging me actually for the last 20 minutes is that I've heard a lot of people across the spectrum saying that we value anti-poverty moves, and in our camp we're doing it, and we're doing it over here too. But the problem is that, yes, I do see that I'll be specific in terms of camps. And the religious right, there are initiatives like Marvin, Olasky. I love that you brought up the orphanage. That there are major initiatives that are happening, and that's true. But when you fund an orphanage in Africa, but then vote for a candidate or a president who's going to put in more conservative people on the Supreme Court, who are then going to X out affirmative action, that's not helping my people. You know what I mean? So I think that's when we get down to it, it's comprehensive. It's not just a matter of whether or not we're going to give more money to a cause. It's really not about money, I don't think. I think it's actually about a comprehensive, full-orbed approach that takes into consideration, where are we sending our money? Is it Africa? Is it Harlem? Is it the Bronx? Is it Compton? But also, are we voting for people and for policies that are going to help those people who are sitting next to us in the pews, who are actually going to our churches, or who are going to the church across the tracks, who are our brothers and sisters in Christ? Yeah. I really believe that we need to take that more seriously.
We've got to move on. I just want to take the last few questions and few comments looking at international human rights and the role of the United States in the world. And we've picked up on some themes of that already, but just to highlight the difficulty, again, of translating a biblical ethic of a concern or normative support for international human rights with what that actually looks like of the role of the United States in the world. We can all be outraged about Darfur, but what do we think about the role of the United Nations or ceding American sovereignty to international courts? When the rubber hits the road, it's not really clear how these translate into public policies. And I wanted to start with Bob because I know he's got some questions and concerns about religious coalitions in the world.
I've been thinking about this whole question of a moral agenda or a new moral agenda. And as I do that, I realize that in addition to everything else that we've been talking about, which is very, very important, there's one thing that I think should be pretty high on that moral agenda, and that is to repair the heavily, heavily damaged relations between this country and many, many other peoples in the world. What we've done in Iraq has had a tremendous effect all through the Muslim world, for instance. People there think, I'm told by Muslims I've talked to, think that the West in general, the United States in particular, and Christians among them, are out to destroy Islam. We have a big repair job to do. And what that means, in my judgment, is understanding other people, paying real attention to what makes them the way they are, and then respecting them. And what respecting them means is respecting their religion as well as their culture. And so I get to the question of whether among evangelicals there is, could be, should be, a perhaps slightly different definition than the traditional one of how to carry out the commandment to make disciples of all nations. How do we repair damages, for instance, with the Muslim world, and at the same time observe the Great Commission? Is there a conflict between the national interest and the Great Commission? Is the way out through this to give up words and let our efforts to proselytize others be by deeds only? I'd be very interested in anything that anybody wanted to say about whether we can repair our reputation and good relations with the rest of the world without seeming to be, who was it? I guess it's Jim's phrase, feeling that, without giving the impression that we're superior, and that has a profound impact, I think, on the question of how you spread the good news.
Michael, did you want to?
Well, I was just thinking, Bob. So I think you're exactly right, and I don't know how to answer the question about sort of America's reputation in the Muslim world, because I think it's extremely, as you say, it's been damaged dramatically, not improved since 9/11. Things have gotten a lot worse. One of the things that I was surprised to learn, there's a sociologist at the University of Texas named Bob Woodbury, who's been doing research about the effect of the Christian missionary movement worldwide, Protestant and Roman Catholic, from 1750 to 1960. He's looking at it all different ways. And most of us who study this assume that the Christian missionaries were sort of the agents of colonial outreach, colonialism writ large. And that many times, they were the ones who were sort of doing the bidding of the home nation state. When in fact, what he has found is that the Christian missionaries were actually sort of undercutting the colonizers' effects. They were the ones who kept the indigenous languages alive by translating the Bible into the indigenous languages. They were oftentimes the ones who built those clinics and hospitals for the indigenous people, sometimes nursing back to health the very people that their fellow countrymen were sort of slaughtering on the shoreline. And that's why the comment about sort of, religious groups being the first responders at Katrina, I think it's interesting to see that here's where you see a real difference between, say, particularly, let's say, conservative Republican foreign policy agenda and evangelical Christian foreign aid they're not always the same, and it's important not to collapse the two.
My particular interest is in evangelizing, proselytizing, saying to somebody else, you've got to become a Christian in order to be saved. I think the Muslims I've talked to tell me they'd prefer a lot less love and a lot more respect. They just don't want to be treated as targets of evangelists. And I'm wondering, Richard, and anybody else, I'm wondering whether in this climate, in the world as it is, whether we in this country need to be a little less aggressive about trying to proselytize for the sake of being respectful to people whose cooperation we all want.
Richard?
Well, first of all, my response would be, first of all, I'm a Christian. And that's way ahead of anything else. American comes in a distant second. And if the price of respecting someone else's faith is to deny mine, the price is too high.
Nobody's denying.
My faith has in it the Great Commission, which is a command to go into all the world and to share the gospel. Not to try to impose it, but an obligation to try to share it. And interestingly enough, we have over 7,000 missionaries on foreign fields, and among the most successful in terms of people who are coming to faith in Christ are people in those very Muslim countries, Muslim converts to the Christian faith who are very happy that those missionaries came. And look, part of it may not be part of your faith, but part of my faith is to go into all the world and to preach the gospel. That's my obligation and responsibility. I don't have the right to impose it. I don't have the right to, if someone says, I don't want to hear it, they have a right to tell me that, and I need to respect it.
But do you feel any real conflict between that obligation and the need for this country to treat everybody else with great respect?
Well, as I said, I want to treat all religions with respect. But if treating another religion with respect requires me to deny my faith, it's too high. Bob, it is. Part of my faith is to be someone who shares my faith. I have a commandment from Jesus Christ to go into all the world and to preach the gospel and to seek to make disciples among all nations. To ask me to forego that is to ask me to deny the direct command of my personal Savior. And so it is, in my view, asking me to deny my faith. And if you're asking me whether my faith is more important than America's reputation in the world, it is.
If I could push us just a little bit onto, for example, U.S. intervention in Rwanda, and now, as Jim Wallis talks a lot about, in Darfur, it's, again, really easy to be outraged about the events in Rwanda as well as Darfur, but there are a lot of countries in the world where human rights persecutions are extremely severe. Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, potentially even China. Clearly, economic interests of trade and national security interests really play into these things. So if we're taking some kind of biblical command to care for brothers and sisters around the world, how do we do the legwork of thinking about what type of public policies that translates into, particularly in the context of, are we invading countries unilaterally and deposing evil dictators, or are we working collaboratively with a UN that we admit probably has some limitations to it? Maybe, Jen, do you want to, because I know you spent some time, or Jim, do you want to start, and then Jen?
I think this ties to the last little exchange here, which was an important one. And I want to go back to a different panel. When Rich Nathan, I'm not sure if he's still here, talked about, there he is, talked about his church in Columbus, and I doubt that he would agree with you that he's not going to deny his faith. He preaches the gospel, but what he leads with, from what I understand, is serving the community. He's leading with serving the community, not saying we're right because we're Christians and you all who have a different faith are wrong. Your faith's bad, ours is good. That's what Bob is right about. Is we, all of us in this room who are Americans, really, all of us, underestimate the depth of resentment and anger there is right now around the world. You feel it in England, not just in Muslim countries, and there's a repair job that's needed. Fortunately, I think a lot of people around the world do still like Americans. They really don't like our foreign policies. And these are evangelical Christians who don't like our foreign policies. So I think the churches, like I'm worried about Iran right now. There are Mennonites in Iran who have been so successful in serving in some of the toughest sort of fundamentalist Islamic communities that they are now in a position to facilitate dialogue between some of us as American religious leaders and Iranian religious leaders. That's going on because they have a credibility. I don't think they ever denied their faith. But they lead with serving, and if we lead with serving, and I'm evangelical enough to not say I'm not going to tell people about Jesus, but I think what Richard was saying, I think, is you lead with serving, and right now we better do a lot of serving because we're up against a lot of hostility where people around the world really do equate American churches and Christianity with American foreign policy. That's just as true around the world, and we have to separate that out more than we have.
Jen, and then Randy.
I would just echo that thought from my experience working for the Presbyterian Church at the United Nations and lobbying the UN and traveling the church and meeting with our missionaries, meeting with many evangelical efforts as well overseas. The concern of this over-identification of American Christianity with American empire and the need to separate those two things out. The interesting thing that's happening with the United Nations is that evangelicals and even Christian right organizations are getting very involved with the United Nations and lobbying as non-governmental organizations. And I have found, and I wrote a book on this called Born Again, the Christian Right Globalized, that as they engage the United Nations, it's not the Antichrist that some of them originally thought it was. And in so much of my work around the global AIDS pandemic, I worked with a lot of evangelicals within my own denomination, and it was interesting to find ways that we could come to some agreement through, again, working in these coalitions. I mean, I remember working with one of my colleagues who was initially very suspicious of the United Nations, but eventually really developed some strong partnerships with the UN AIDS program. At the same time, she was a strong advocate of abstinence education in addition to some of the other approaches, and that was something that she was able to bring to the table and show that, you know, everybody could weigh in on this issue in their own way, and those approaches didn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Randy?
Should go without saying, but it hasn't yet been said. First step toward repairing our relationship with the rest of the world, it seems to me, is to unequivocally denounce this administration's systematic use of torture.
Other respondents to this question of translating a biblical ethic for concern for brothers and sisters into shaping a foreign policy. So we're all to the table. We all take this ethic seriously. What do we think about intervention? What do you think about political strategies that improve the protection of human rights in some of these countries that we've been talking about?
Well, the United States historically has stood for liberty, and Christianity stands for liberty. Christianity, of all the major religions, is a religion so much based on faith that you can't force a person to have faith. You can force a person to take certain actions. You can't force a person to have faith. So Christianity, by its very nature, is a religion of liberty. Now, there's no contradiction, then, between these two, unless we start to think, well, much as in the 1600s and 1700s, that the religion of the subjects of a country should be the religion of the ruler. I mean, Bob, I appreciate what you're saying, but it's not as if in Islam, these are all, in the Islamic countries, these are all happy campers. A lot of them realize the dictatorship under which they live, the religious dictatorship as well as political dictatorship, and they're looking for liberty. So they don't look upon someone evangelizing as an alien force coming into their country. They're looking that that person is a liberator.
I disagree.
At this point, we are just about out of time, and we're going to take just a few questions from the audience, but I'm going to force you all into bullet point mode. And if you were either a religious activist or a consultant or a sociologist or a journalist, and you could offer one bullet point to put on a strategy memo for building a new moral agenda of co-religionists who are trying to unite around areas of consensus, if you could offer one bullet point under 50 words, what would it be? And we'll start with David and go straight down the row, and then we'll go to questions. And you can pass if you don't want to.
One word.
Bullet point. It could be a sentence.
Come back to me. Let me think about it for a minute.
I'd like to expand radically what it means to be pro-life. And it seems to me if you're pro-life, I think you have a good bit of difficulty in justifying the war in Iraq. I think you have even more difficulty justifying the use of torture. And it seems to me that people who claim to hear a fetal scream and yet turn a deaf ear to the very real screams of fully formed human beings who are being tortured, there's a fundamental inconsistency there.
Michael?
I was going to say torture, Randy, so.
Okay. Tyler?
I don't mean to be cryptic, but I'd say don't forget your first love. I think that the integrity is important.
I'd say looking at the American family and the economic situation of American families needs to be fleshed out.
A world in which 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day is neither just nor stable. And the fundamental inequality of the world, I think, is fundamentally the biblical issue and is connected to all the other issues that we're talking about.
Lisa?
I think we need to affirm the inherent dignity of every human being, both unborn but also born, and make the born part as equally important as the unborn across the board.
I believe, I would say, standing for the sanctity and the absolutely incalculable value to God of every human being, from conception to natural death and everywhere in between.
Since torture has been mentioned a couple of times, I would say the bullet point would be know ourselves, because I think that people in those Muslim countries, like Iran, for instance, know our interventions and know the torture they went through because of our interventions. People in Iraq know that before the war even began, 500,000 kids under the age of 5 died as a direct result of sanctions. So there's a reason for the anger.
Marvin?
Well, I'm thinking of what Miroslav Volf said this morning about our tendency towards self-absorption. Abortion is a result of self-absorption. Ineffective poverty fighting that makes us feel good but doesn't really help people is a result of self-absorption. And in so many areas, that's the case. And the way out of self-absorption is to be absorbed with Christ.
David?
I guess two sort of polar kind of dimensions. Every human being is made in the image of God, and be pragmatic about looking at results, care about results.
Bob?
Finding a way to be humble and respectful to others all over the world, and at the same time be very smart about how we go about trying to help others here and abroad, and all that adds up to being loving, I think.
We just have time to take one question. 2 questions. Chrissy?
Over 50% of congregations in the United States and certainly globally, the percentage skyrockets. In these conversations about religion and politics, where are the women in these coalitions, and at least in the leadership of these movements? Why are they so absent? And that's a question not just for the women, but also for the men.
I guess my first response would be they're not absent. Most of the coalition meetings I go to, women make up at least half the participants.
Yeah, I'd say women are definitely in a key role, but they're often doing the hardest work and not getting all the credit. But having said that, I mean, I just think of all the coalitions that I've been a part of where women are really behind the scenes. But I think that's changing very quickly. I mean, at least in the nexus I'm working with within Washington, D.C., there are a whole lot of women in leadership and rising to the top and people mentoring us along the way. So I think that's changing very rapidly.
The leader of New York Faith and Justice is a woman. The leader of Boston Faith and Justice is a woman. It's a different conversation when you're talking grassroots coalitions than discussions with heads of churches, theologians, and the kind of elites that we tend to invite to conferences, which is still way more male than it ought to be. But women face a triple jeopardy here. One, all the problems we talked about today, all of them, affect women disproportionately to men. The consequences affect women more. 2, women still in the middle of that are the primary ones responsible for holding life together while they're being affected so adversely. And 3, they have the least chance to change the circumstances that victimize them the most and make life hard to hold together. And that triple jeopardy is still a fundamental fact of gender disparity. And until we deal with that, we haven't dealt with the real issue, which is more than just getting, there's one head of a denomination or 2 now on the main line that are women, and that's good, but it's a lot deeper than that. It's the fundamental gender inequality at the grassroots level of the world. But that's where the leaders are rising up.
One last question.
I picked up Bob Benson, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, this brochure on the way in, and reading it from the first page, I think we're sort of letting you off easy. this idea of a coalition of the faithful shaping a new moral agenda. Because there's a comment here on this first page which has direct relevance here, I think, regarding the malfunctioning of faith, which gives inspiration and seeming legitimacy to people's unconscionable deeds, and it continues on. The malfunctioning of faith, which goes back to mentions of heightened interrogation and so forth. And this malfunctioning of faith, I have a very near relationship, I think, living 2 blocks from a church in which the local, and it's a Southern Baptist Convention church. The local minister is a leader of the anti-abortion group in South Dakota, pickets regularly around the state, and I have heard him many, many, many times directly say that he advocates the killing of any of the doctors which come over from Minnesota to perform abortions. Now, to me, that seems to be a malfunctioning of the faith. And I would like to hear some of you, especially Pastor Land, address that, since that's part of his own group.
Well, first of all, I led the formation of a group that issued the Nashville Declaration of Conscience, which said that if you believe in the sanctity of human life, that includes doctors' lives, even doctors who perform abortions, and that it is unconscionable to take another human being's life because you disagree with them about something they're doing. And so I'd be happy to send you a copy of that. It was widely circulated, but you understand, of course, that there are 43,700 Southern Baptist churches, and they are each autonomous, and they each call their own pastor and fire their own pastor, and they choose to participate at whatever level they choose to participate in the convention. That's why it's called a convention and not a church or churches. It is a convention. And I certainly would vehemently disagree with anyone who advocated taking the law into their own hands for any circumstance, and particularly in the name of the sanctity of human life, to argue for the destruction of another human being, whatever that human being may be doing.
The best answer to your question is a new book I want to plug, not by anybody here. Brian McLaren has a new book out this week, I think, called Everything Must Change. And Brian McLaren, he has 4 dysfunctions. One is a security dysfunction. One is an economic dysfunction. One is an environmental dysfunction. And one is a faith dysfunction. And the 4th dysfunction, if we could begin to heal that, could help heal, he says, the other 3. And I think he's right.
Thanks, Jim. Just a quick note. No. Okay. Thank you. We're going to turn it to David for one last comment, and then we have to wrap.
One last dysfunctional comment. That's really the subject of this book that I wrote, which is called Unchristian, which is essentially looking at all the ways in which faith has failed to live up to the promise that it could. And for that, I, as a researcher, as a Christian, I'm sorry about that. And I think as we move forward in the coalition building, we have to be willing to say we're sorry for the things that we failed at, for not living up to the potential of the generosity, the kind of incomes that we have, the kinds of friendships that we could have. Those are huge places that we failed in terms of our hypocritical lifestyles, in terms of our judgmentalism. It doesn't mean, again, that we disavow the idea that there's something unique about what it means to follow Christ. But in following Christ, we've been judged by young outsiders not for our righteousness, but for our self-righteousness. And there is, I think, really an accounting to pay for that as Christians. And so as we build this, these are some complex issues. As we talk about building coalitions, how do we get through and pierce people's Pride, that's a huge sin issue that Jesus talks about. How do we pierce people's unwillingness to go to the margins of society and deal with people that have deep needs? I mean, these are challenging issues that the church hasn't always been willing to address.
And my hope is that the pain and the frustration that you've experienced and so many people have experienced from religions themselves or religious people is juxtaposed to the exciting developments that you hear from some of the religious leaders and some of the religious activists that are here today, and we've heard described by the journalists and by the sociologists and the commentators. We really are, as students, as part of the Yale Forum on Faith and Politics, we are excited about this. We're excited to be part of it, to help to shape it. We're excited about the moral convictions that people are bringing in a respectful way, a way that is excited about pluralism, is excited about valuing people that they seriously disagree with. We try to live that out at the Yale Forum on Faith and Politics, and I hope we somewhat live that out in this panel today. So I want to thank all of you for coming, but particularly offer a round of applause for our panelists.